this is Macroeconomics, lecture number 4. We continue with Bernanke's textbook. Last time we covered 2.1 and 2.2. Today we continue with 2.3. Hopefully we'll get through the end of the chapter. So, this chapter is about savings and wealth. This section of the chapter. So, savings. The definition of savings is fairly straightforward and common sense. Whatever has been produced and not consumed. So, this is alternatively the unconsumed portion of output. Okay? So, this is simply the definition of savings. The definition of wealth is the value of all assets. The value of all assets. Usually it is nice to provide a definition of an asset. So an asset is something of value which we own and have a control over. So you must own it and you also must control it. The classical counterexample of something of real value is air, fresh air. We breathe it, yes, sure, it's a value, we die immediately without it, but we don't own it and we don't control it. So we don't count fresh air as our asset or anybody's asset. Another classical example is the sun in the sky. Sure, it brings value and all the good stuff, but we don't count it as an asset. We can't control the sun, the rain, etc. So, asset is something of value. Wealth is the sum of all assets. Now, let me provide now the difference between wealth and what will be net wealth. Net is usually associated in economics with subtracting some sort of value. If you have an asset, let's say a machine, in order to get the net value of the asset, you must subtract the depreciation of the machine. If you have certain assets, in order to get their net asset value, you must subtract the debts or the obligations or the liabilities. So, let's try to define the next concept, which is liability. So, liability is a debt or obligation which will require possibly an asset to be paid down or liquidated. In other words, if I owe you 500 leva, I'll need 500 in cash, or maybe 5 textbooks were each worth 100, with which I will pay down my debt. An example will be a house. You bought the house for 100,000. Now the house is worth 120,000. When you bought it with 100,000, your house, you bought it with 80,000 mortgage. So the 80,000 mortgage is an obligation. This obligation is called also a liability. So what you have in this house, which is the net asset value of the house, or sometimes known the net wealth in your house, and here is a new term to use, net worth, and net worth is the same as net wealth. is the difference between the value of the house and your obligation, in this case, 40. For houses and for businesses, the difference between assets and liabilities or obligations is called equity. So we say that you have an 80,000 mortgage and a 40,000 equity, and the value of the house is 120. So let me backtrack now where I came from. So wealth we usually define as the sum of all assets, and net wealth we define as the sum of all assets minus the sum of all liabilities. In other words, the value of everything that you own must the value of everything that you owe. Okay? Does that make sense? And now there is that last confusion. Sometimes authors like to use the word wealth to be synonymous with net wealth. In other words, some authors use wealth as the sum of all assets minus the sum of all liabilities. So the point is, when we use the word wealth, the meaning is ambiguous and the meaning is unclear. Some people use it to mean only the value of your assets, and other people use it to mean the value of your assets minus the value of your liabilities. For everyone in the world, every economist and every businessman, the term net wealth is clear and unambiguous. For everybody in the world, it unambiguously means the sum of assets minus the sum of liabilities. Okay?
Can I ask you?
Yes, go ahead.
Is net wealth the same as equity?
Yes, so also wealth is used in the same way as equity. But equity is more used by businesses and corporations, and for households, people and individuals, they kind of like to prefer to use wealth. From wealth comes the adjective wealthy. You have a lot of wealthy individuals and millionaires. So that's why wealth and equity has effectively the same meaning. Now, here is another key point to consider. Wealth is effectively the accumulation of savings. You save this month 1,000, you save next month 1,000, you save the month after that 1,000, and soon you'll be a wealthy person. Now it's a whole different story how you invested in the type of returns you're going to get. I don't want to get into this course, at least in lecture 4, on this subject. So that's the point to understand about wealth and about assets, obligations, etc. Now we get to the point of income and wealth. So there is a difference between income and wealth. Income is the earnings or the amount of money or the amount of product which we produce over a given period of time, 1 month or 1 year. For a worker, his income is whatever he earns, $1,000 a month. Wealth is the value of all assets that have been accumulated throughout the many years and possibly inherited from fathers, grandfathers, and so forth. Okay? So that is the difference between wealth and income. Now, in economics, let's do this now before I get to other things. That's part of a section a little later today, is the difference between what is called in economics a stock variable and a flow. Variable. So, you probably have studied already in macroeconomics the difference between a stock variable and a flow variable. A stock variable measures something at any particular point in time. A flow variable, when you try to measure it for one particular point in time, has no meaning. A flow variable has a meaning only for a period of time. Say, I'm working, I'm teaching now, I'm earning a salary as I'm teaching. Right at this second, right at this moment, I earn nothing. I earn for the period of 45 minutes during this lecture, or for the period of 75 minutes during the lecture, or I earn a salary for a month. So, for any period of time, I have a meaningful concept, a meaningful definition of income. Let's try an example of a stock variable. Classical example of a stock variable is unemployment. Right this minute, right this second, right this moment, there is exact number of unemployed people today, meaning people that are looking for a job and don't have a job at this point. So, you have 1,100,000 unemployed today. Well, tomorrow you will have a different number. 1,200,000 unemployed tomorrow. Okay? So, for a stock variable, at any point in time, you have a variable. Let's try a third stock variable. A third stock variable for anybody is the amount of money that you have in your wallet. Well, I'm rich, apparently. So, I have like $222, for example, maybe $3, I don't know. The point is, it is a specific number of dollars. It is a stock variable. The word stock comes out of, or synonymous in English with the word inventory. So, I have an inventory of $320, well, Bulgarian leva in my wallet, okay? So, if you have a deposit at the bank and you have a deposit of $750 or 750 leva, for you, this is a stock variable. So, stock variable is also associated with a balance. In my account, I have, let's say, 700 leva balance, meaning outstanding balance. So this amount of money I can withdraw at any point in time. So that's a classical example of a stock variable. Now, unemployed people, or let's try differently. In unemployment, at any point in any day, some people get laid off and other people from the unemployed get hired. So, for any flow variable, the classical example is that of a pool, and the pool will have a certain level, let's say 1 million liters of water. There is always, well, at least theoretically, always a flow coming in and a flow going out. So, in a flow variable, you must always have an inflow and an outflow. An inflow is something that increases the stock of a variable, increases the value in a variable. An outflow is something that decreases the stock. So, if this is the pool of unemployed people, corporate layoffs represent an increase in the pool of unemployed. So corporate layoffs are an inflow to the pool of unemployed people. And at the same time, new corporate hiring represents an outflow of the pool. Okay? So, similarly with wealth. If this was my wealth, well, my wealth, let's simplify, is $2,000 in my account or somewhere under the mattress, right? So if I make this month 1,000, I spend 700, and I save 300, the savings will represent an inflow to my wealth. So if I have 2,000 wealth and I add 300 savings, my wealth will increase to 2,300. Is it clear? Does it make sense? Alright, so in economics it is extremely important that you always pay attention for different variables, whether they're stock and whether they're flow.
Can we say that the flow variable represents the change in the stock variable?
Yes, indeed. That's exactly the meaning. The flow variable represents the change. And now, out of flow variable, because we have an inflow and an outflow, sometimes for clarity, we usually say net flow. So, the net flow, by definition, simply means inflow minus outflow. So in this case, if we really have to be precise with this particular terminology, it will be much better to say that the net flow represents the change in the stock variable. Okay? Alright, so another example will be inflation. The price level at the beginning of the year is one price level. At the end of the year is a different price level. The difference, better probably, let's say the ratio between the two price levels, represents the rate of price inflation. So you cannot define inflation for this moment. You can define inflation only for one day, or maybe 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year. So inflation is the difference or the ratio of price levels between two different points in time. So inflation can be defined only for a period of time. And therefore, inflation is a flow variable. Okay? In this sense, it represents, well, what is really the flow? Really, the flow is the printing press spreading banknotes around, which drive the price level higher. One example of it. Alright, is this good enough? Alright, so where was I? I was on savings and wealth. Alright, so let's do some more stuff here on savings. We get now to one of the most important relationships in macroeconomics. What is the definition of savings? The definition of savings, we just say S. S is typically used to shorten or abbreviate savings, common sense stuff. And I'm using 3 dashes here instead of 2, not to say not simply that it is equal to, but it is equal by definition. This is how we define savings. We define it as Y, which is total output. In other words, everything that we have produced, Y is from last lecture, if you remember, let's say the measurement of GDP, minus consumption. So, the idea goes that savings equals output minus consumption, the unconsumed output. So, that is one way to think about it. Now, a completely different way to think about it from last lecture is to think about the expenditure approach. What did expenditure say? Okay, let's move on. Sorry guys, let me hear. If S is equal by definition to Y plus C, it follows mathematically that Y is equal to C plus S. In other words, if something is produced, it is either consumed or saved. There is no third alternative. Now, let's look at the expenditure approach from last time. The expenditure approach from last time is, let me use red again, is equal to consumption plus investment plus government saving plus net exports. For the moment, let's assume temporarily that government is zero. We call this a simplifying assumption. Simplifying assumption makes things simpler and easier to understand, and later on we relax the assumption. To relax it means we remove it back. So, if government is non-existent and if there are no exports or imports, which is x is 0, this one becomes y equal to c plus I. So, let me rewrite this for convenience. Y is equal to c plus s. So, if y equals to c plus I and y is equal to c plus s, it must follow from elementary mathematics that s equals I. So, the interpretation is simple. The interpretation is that savings in the macroeconomy must equal investments. Again, part of this identity is equal to the definition of investments, which also includes inventories. So we define increase in inventories as an investment. So if we produce a little bit more bicycles or a little bit more computers and we were not able to sell them, we counted these as investments, besides machines, equipment, and other stuff. So what this simply says is that for any economy, for any point in time, for any period of time, savings always equal investment.
But we treat only the case when government savings and exports are zero. So.
Right, so we will get to this now. I'm getting to this now. So when these are zero, it follows immediately. I just made the simplification. In 5 minutes, I'll try to make you happier. Alright? So, let's see now. This simply means that the investments for any economy are determined entirely by the savings of the economy. Okay? This simply means that if an economy wants to be healthy, strong, prosperous, productive, and growing, there's only one way that this can be accomplished. With more capital. If we have more machines, more equipment, more cars, more productive resources, only then we can be more productive ourselves. So, the standard of living for people depends on people's productivity. And people's productivity depends entirely on the amount of capital or the productive resources that they have at their disposal. And the amount of capital or productive resources depends on one thing only: investments. And investments in turn depend on one thing only: savings. So, the logic to think about it is that savings, through its equality with investments, is the driving force of the economy and results in long-term economic growth. A nation can become prosperous only with a high savings rate. Other things equal, one nation with a higher savings rate will certainly have faster economic growth. Now the two examples are United States and China. China has the highest savings rate in the world, 40%. Grows rapidly, 10, 11, 12%. The numbers came out at 11.7% for 2007. while at the same time the United States has the lowest savings rate in the world. For the last year it's a little bit negative, maybe 0, maybe 1% negative. So with the lowest savings rate, no wonder the US economy isn't growing, has hard times growing. In other words, in order to grow, it's got to import savings from abroad. I'm going to get to that. Now, let's get to your question. If we include here savings plus investment plus G, it will turn out, and here is a nifty trick that I can do, you guys can, is I can wipe this off, and it will turn out that savings will equal to investments plus G, which is the government budget deficit or the government budget surplus. So, what this means, the new interpretation now is, if something is saved, it is either invested or consumed by the government. Let's explain the meaning of the word G here a little bit more. G in this case means government taxes minus government spending. So, what is taxes for a government? We call this revenue. So, T represents government revenues, and spending represents government outlays. Revenues minus spending is the definition of savings. So, a tricky way to go about this is to define this as savings of the government. Let's try and use this B here. So, you see now what happened? What happened is that if we have a government deficit is equivalent to taxes less than spending. In other words, the meaning of a deficit is that the government spends more than it collects. Okay? Well, this is the same as government savings. I'll use only gov here. S, government. Government savings is negative. Okay? That makes sense? So, if the government collects less than it spends, it doesn't save. In this case, there's a word in English to describe this. It is called dis-saving. Okay? Dis-saving. And now we have the opposite. If the government runs what we define or call a surplus, the opposite sign is in effect. Taxes are greater than spending, and this is equivalent to positive government spending. Is it clear? Like, this is just common sense and definition, common sense understanding of the word deficit and the word surplus. So, now I define the concept of government savings. Well, here is the next nifty trick. Again, it is common sense that total savings in the economy, let me see where I'm going to write. I'm going to write here. That total savings in the economy will be the sum of public savings and private savings. Let's write this out so that you can just understand it. Okay, so S savings are by definition. In other words, if it's saved, it must be saved either by the private sector or by the government or the public sector. No third alternative. So we decompose savings into S private plus S public by mere definition. Okay? Is that fairly straightforward? And now comes the next little trick. The next little trick is that S public was, if you would remember, the G. The G here, okay? Is that fairly clear? So, now we get that S is equal to S private plus G, okay? S is equal to S private plus G. But here is the next trick. From this here, S equal to I plus G, it follows that investments equal to private savings. Private savings. So, here is an alternative way to think about it. The more the government taxes people, the less people can save, and therefore the lower the investments in the economy. Okay? So that's the one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is whatever everybody saves, it is either invested or consumed by the government, used up by the government. Alright? So that's the next interpretation of it. And now, to make this guy even happier, right, we should use the X, which is this assumption. So what I did so far was give the meaning and interpretation of G equal to 0. Now we're going to use this X equal to 0. So I do the same trick all over again. I can afford it. And that is I plus G plus, I'm going to use the new term here, CA, which stands for current account. So, the current account represents flows with foreigners or flows with the foreign sector. So, the new meaning or the new interpretation is that if I save it, it is either invested locally, spent by the government, or invested abroad. Invested abroad. Alright? Okay, invested abroad means the capital is shipped abroad. Now, whether the foreigner will actually consume it or invest it, it is not clear, meaning we cannot deduce, we cannot make any conclusion. So, this is associated with export of capital or import of capital, even though it is called current account. Okay? So, from this perspective, we can say that when we import capital from abroad, the interpretation is that we're importing savings. When we import foreign savings, we can do one of two things. We can either invest them or we can consume them. So, when you import savings from abroad, a classical example today is the United States. It has huge current account deficit. So, let's write this out for your benefit, guys. When you have a current account deficit, the meaning or the interpretation is that you import savings from abroad. This is known in economics as importing capital. So we import it in the form of capital. So, United States has a current account deficit. This means that the rest of the world is saving and the United States is importing the savings. Today, Bulgaria has a huge current account deficit, roughly 20% of GDP. This simply means that foreigners, most notably Western Europeans, are saving tons of money which we are importing. So, the key to our prosperity depends on whether we are actually consuming these foreign savings or whether we are investing these foreign savings. Okay? Is that clear so far? Alright, so that's the meaning and interpretation of the current account. So, the current account will have a surplus, and when you have a current account surplus, this means that you export your savings abroad. Today, China has huge current account surpluses. Well, they have these surpluses because they have very high savings rate. So, if you save a lot, you can export some of your savings abroad. So, what they're doing is they're exporting their savings to the United States, and the United States uses these savings to consume. Alright? So, that's what is a current account surplus and a current account deficit. One little step is that if one country has a surplus, the other one's got to have a deficit, okay? If you have 3 countries, the sum of all surpluses must equal the sum of all deficits. If you have 100 countries, the sum of the surpluses must necessarily equal the sum of the deficits. In other words, for 2 countries, one country's surplus necessarily means the other country's deficit, okay? Let's see what else we have here. Oh, I caught myself like 3-4 times the term savings rate. Savings rate. So, savings rate, where's my thing here? So, savings rate is simply the current savings is simply the current savings divided by the current output or the current income. The current income. And usually in percentage terms. When I was in the United States and I was working on a major corporation, SBC Communications, I was making after tax, for me, after tax, I was making roughly $4,000 after tax. Pre-tax I was making roughly $6,000, so government was taking 2. I was getting a net income, so I should possibly say also net income, 4,000. And I was roughly spending 2,000, and I was roughly saving 2,000. So back then I had a roughly 50% savings rate. Okay? So that's an example. If you're making, let's say, 1,000, making means that's your income, and if you're saving only 100, your savings rate is correspondingly 10%. Of course, it is possible to have a net savings rate. Alright, is that clear? So that's what it is. Savings rate is the percentage of income which is saved. Let's see what else we have. Saving. Okay, private saving, I covered it. Government saving, I covered it. Government surpluses, okay. So, this one is called sometimes national savings. So, the national savings equals private savings and savings. So this is called national savings. All right. Let's try this here. This identity, I'm looking here at 41, a little bit of modification. That will be in the textbook equation 211. This equation here is called the uses of savings identity. So, if the author is using the word identity, it means that it holds at all times. It means that it is always true, and it is true by definition. So, for them, this identity actually is with 3 dashes. So, this one is called the uses of savings identity. Uses of savings identity. So, the uses of savings identity, let me repeat for a third time, simply means that when people save, their savings are used either to invest, either by the government, or exported abroad. And these are the 3 alternatives to using the savings. Is this good enough? Well, we're not done for today. Let's see. So, stock flow variables, this one is covered. Alright, so let's do the next concept. National wealth. So, remember, wealth was the value of all assets of a person. The value of all assets of a household. The value of all assets for a corporation. Alright? For all of these, we usually use the net wealth. Okay? So, national wealth is simply the sum of the wealth of all units in the economy. So, the sum of wealth of all individuals and all corporations and the government. So, the national wealth is the sum of the wealth of the individual. In economics, we use the most general term, is called entity. So, when you say entity, you may mean a specific person, you may mean a household, you may mean a county, you may mean a state, like the state of Ohio. You may mean a business. You may mean a university, alright? Or you may mean the whole nation, okay? So, that's the most general word in economics. Well, it's a general word in English to use, is entity, okay? So, national wealth is the sum of all. It depends on the national savings rate. The more the nation saves, the faster it accumulates wealth. Now, here is a general proverb which is well known, is that no nation has consumed its way into prosperity. It simply means that no nation has become prosperous by consuming. Okay? Consumption is a result of prosperity. If I am rich, I can consume a lot. But because I consume a lot, this doesn't make me rich. That's common sense stuff. In other words, what makes a nation rich is a lot of saving and a lot of investments, and therefore a lot of productivity, and therefore higher output. And if you produce a lot more, you can only then consume a lot more. So, wealth and prosperity is caused and created by savings and investment, not by consumption. Okay? So, here is one of the problems with Keynesian policies. one of the problems with Keynesian policies is that anytime there's a problem, Keynesians say we got to boost spending, whether it's consumption or government spending. Sure, no problem with boosting spending this year, but then Keynesians wants to boost it next year and the year after that. So anytime you boost consumption or government spending, in either case by our identity, you lower the savings rate, the private savings rate, and you ultimately lower the investment. So what you must understand is that the Keynesian solution to boost more consumption, to stimulate the economy, is good for a year, good for a two. But if for a country like the United States and some of the Western European countries, but much more for the United States, if the government tries a year after a year for many decades to boost consumption, it must necessarily lower the savings, as it has been now the lowest savings rate in the world, and it necessarily lowers foreign debt and investments, and the result is the overall long-term impoverishment of the nation. Okay? Alright, so let's see what else we have. Well, I think that's part 4.3. We have about 10-15 minutes. Let's move on to part 2.4, which is real GDP, price indexes, and inflation. So, usually we have GDP, and GDP could be in what is called nominal terms. If it is in nominal terms, we call it nominal GDP, and it could be in real terms. Number of cigarettes, number of pens, number of textbooks, or it's going to be quantity of kilowatts that we consume, liters of gasoline that we burn. So, you either have it in nominal or in real terms. So, real terms is associated with adjusting for inflation. So, another way of saying it is that real means inflation adjusted. Nominal simply means in current dollars with current prices. So, current is the key word here. Current dollars. So, if you adjust for inflation, you convert nominal values into real values. Okay? So, that's the main idea. Real values will be, for example, this year we produced, let's say, 5 million Cokes. Next year we produced 6 million Coke, no, to drink. So, from 5 to 6 we have a 20, the guys are laughing on the back, right? They mean other type of Coke, I don't know. Alright, so, from 5 million to 6 million, that will be a 20% increase in Coke production. Of course, indeed, Coke production increased the most. Remember where? Afghanistan, correct, perfect answer. So, Afghanistan, but this type of Coke is of course drugs, narcotics, have been able to industrialize quite well and actually record the highest economic growth in the world by means of rapidly increasing the production of Coke. This is the drug, this is the narcotic, this is the thing that kills people, alright? Not the kind of Coke we like to drink, you know, during lunch and dinner. Alright guys, so, from 5 million to 6 million, that's 20% growth of Coke, alright? So, we may consider values in nominal or in real terms. Now, let me introduce another concept here, the concept of a CPI. The concept of a CPI simply means consumer price index, consumer price index. So now I have to define what is a price index before I get to the consumer price index. So a price index is some sort of weighted average of prices of a number of goods. So an example of a price index is Coke last night cost, let's say, Bulgarian lev. Bulgarian lev we like to denote it with BGN. And beer will cost 2 BGN. And we will further assume, for the sake of example, that each has an equal weight. So we say 50% beer and 50% Coke. Of course, you all know that's really not true. I mean, you guys, when you go to the bars, you drink a whole lot more beers than Coke, right? So, but the point is, if these are equal, the average price index is 1.5. Let's try this. If the weighting instead was beer 90%, more realistic, and Coke 10%. In other words, for every Coke that you drink 10 beers, the price level will be more like 1.9. Okay? So, this is the price level 1.9, and a price index is simply the measurement of a price level. Okay? That's what it is. So, you may have a price index, let's say for the Cokes from 2 years ago, from 2005. You may have a price index for 2007. And if you want to get the inflation for these 2 years, you simply divide the price index of 2007. You divide it by the price index of 2005, and you will get the, remember from last time, the price inflation. So this will be the price inflation, and remember what I was saying, inflation is always a period concept. You must say for the period of 2005 through 2007. So, this is a general price index. Now I have to develop, which is something very simple, the consumer price index. So, the key that I'm trying to key point to understand is that you can create a price index for anything, for any goods, for any commodities. So, if you create it for the price level of the bars, you're going to get the bar price index, right? If you want to create the prices and price levels price index here at the university, you can get that one too. So, one most common way is to create an index is by using what households consume. So, this one is called popularly consumer basket, and sometimes called consumer basket of goods and services. This would mean how much bread costs, how much gasoline costs, how much electricity costs, how much water costs, how much dentist costs. So you take an average consumer basket, which means the consumer basket that the average Bulgarian or average American family consumes, and for it you construct a price index. So the price index that we construct for the average consumer family, we call the consumer price index. So, the consumer price index becomes the basis of measuring price inflation. Is that one clear? And now we get to another very special type of a price index. So you have a price index, but not for the consumer, but for the whole economy. What was the proxy for the whole economy? So what did we use that best measures the output of the whole economy? That will be GDP. So if you take the whole basket to be the entire economy or the entire product of the economy, then you get a special type of price index. It has a special name called GDP deflator. So, GDP deflator, okay? So, GDP deflator is the price index of the whole economy. And then we have one very important relationship, is that, let me see now, real GDP divided by, or nominal GDP divided by real GDP. Let's see how it works. Real equals nominal. So, the real equals by the definition of the deflator nominal divided by the GDP deflator. Alright? So, in other words, if you want to get the real, then you must divide the nominal by the GDP deflator. A different way of saying is that the GDP deflator is equal by definition to, this comes here, this comes there, to nominal divided by GDP. Alright? So, how much time? 2 minutes, is it? Let's see if I have anything else. Well, I've covered consumer price index, I've covered the inflation rate. What is it?
Nominal divided by GDP or by real?
Oh, that's by real. Sorry, nominal divided. Yeah, thank you. Nominal divided by real here. Alright, so I have covered everything up to section 2.5. So, we have 1 minute left. We are effectively done for today. Next time I continue with 2.5. And then we move on to 3.1, 3.5, and 3.6. And we're done. Okay? Wait, let me see how I have it, if I have it here. It says the saying goes, it takes buying to drive the stocks, up, but they can fall of their own weight. In other words, if you're in a bull market, in a bull trend, you gotta watch the volume. You may only have a correction, so volume is extremely important. Alright, let's see. Another very important indicator, 15. How much time we got, guys?
5 minutes.
Only 5, okay. So, another important part of technical analysis is sentiment. Sentiment means how investors feel about the invested asset. Today in Bulgaria, there is this sentiment which suggests that real estate prices can never, ever possibly fall down. And sure, they collapsed in the US, but the US is a different continent. They collapsed in UK, in Spain. Now they're about to collapse in Greece. Well, they already collapsed on the Black Sea, but in Sofia, that will never, ever possibly happen. When people have that kind of sentiment and that kind of beliefs, you are right around the top. You're right around or close to the top. So you have what's called bullish sentiment and bearish sentiment. Today you have a classical example of a bearish sentiment in crude oil. Crude oil has been going up for 7 years in a row. Every single year it's been up from the previous year. And still the bearish sentiment prevails on Wall Street. Still, if you ask Wall Street, they will tell you that oil in 2008 will go down. Most of the major investment banks and top economists and everybody else tell us that oil is going to be in the 70, 80 range. Possibly they admit that the average might be 85. They are still bearish because oil is over 90, it has been over 90, and early this year it was over $100. So they still have this bearish sentiment which they have not abandoned for the last 7 years, which they have held for 20 years. Oil like gold has been going down for a good 20 years. So they've had the bearish sentiment for 20 years, and 7 years later they still cannot shake off their bearish sentiment. Well, what this got to do with the market going up? Well, the answer is